Alright, so in this video we're going to see how we can add our own sprites to our Flappy Bird app, and we'll do a little bit of basic animation as well to make our bird flap up and down. Alright, so to be able to add our sprites we're going to need some images for them. So you can download these from androiddevcourse.com/flappybirdassets.zip. So just go to flappybirdassets.zip. There'll be a folder there, or a zip file that downloads, and then just open up that zip file and you'll have a little folder with, very simple, we've got a background, we've got bird in 2 states, so you might just be able to see there, we've got wings up and then wings down. And then we've got 2 tubes, so this is a tube coming up from the bottom and coming down from the top. That's all we need, very simple. And of course we're going to need to add those to our app. The way I would do it is to go over to Android Studio and open the Android and then Assets folder. So you can see that's where we've got badlogic.jpg, the default there, and then I'm just going to reveal that in the Finder. Again, if you're on Windows, you can open it in Windows Explorer instead. And then just select those images and drag them into the Assets folder like that. There we go. Now we can go back over and you can see they're all there. Wonderful. And I'm actually going to get rid of badlogic.jpg because we don't need that anymore. Alright, just before we add our first sprite, there's one change I want to make, and that is, we noticed last time that the app is in landscape mode by default. Now that's great for most games, but Flappy Bird is actually one of the few games that you play in portrait mode, or that's how we're going to make it anyway. So if you go into Android Manifests and then Android Manifest, you can see we've got all the usual stuff that we're used to and then a bit of other stuff as well. The key thing that we want to change here is the screen orientation. So obviously we want to change it from landscape to portrait. Okay, so now we're in a position to add our code. So pretty much everything we do is going to be in this single Flappy Bird class here. And I'm just going to get rid of everything that's here and here as well. In fact, maybe we'll leave that one line. And so we're more or less starting from scratch. So as I mentioned in the previous video, we've got 2 main methods here. The create method, which happens obviously when the app is run, and the render method that happens continuously as the app is processed. So our main aim here is to add a couple of sprites. We're going to start with the background, and then we're going to bring in our Flappy Bird. And we add our sprites as a batch. So sprite batch is exactly what you might think. A sprite is essentially an image or a character or a background, something like that. And we create a sprite batch to manage the displaying and animation of those sprites. So the first thing that we're going to do to add our background is to begin our batch. So this just tells the render method that we're going to start displaying sprites now. And we're only going to display the one, but we're going to display the background. So instead of having a texture called image, let's have a texture called background. And a texture, it really is just an image. It's exactly the same thing, but in game creation, they're known as textures rather than images. And then we're going to define which image this background is going to be. So we want a new texture created from, and of course we're going to use bg.png, background.png. So now this background refers to this texture, and then to display it we take our batch and then we draw, and you can see we've got a bunch of options there of ways that we can draw things. And the main ones that we're going to be using is like this third one down. So we give the texture first, then the x coordinate and the y coordinate, then the width, and that one, if you could see it, would say height. So very simple, we give the x coordinate, y coordinate, the width, and then the height. So start with the texture, background, then the x coordinate. I want this background to be full screen. So I want it to begin at the bottom left. So 0, 0. Then I want the width to be the same as the width of the screen. And I can get that from the GDX library using gdx.graphics.getWidth. There we go. You can maybe anticipate what's going to come next. We want the height of this thing to be the same as the height of the screen, which is gdx.graphics.getHeight. Simple as that. And then that's all we're having this time. So then we use batch and end. And simple as that. So we've now created our render method and we've told it to repeatedly display the background on our phone screen, and we're stretching it so that it's going to be whole screen because the bottom left of our image is going to be the bottom left of the screen, the width is going to be the width of the screen, and the height is going to be the height of the screen. So let's just take a look. There we go. There's our lovely background stretched to full screen. Wonderful. So that's a good start. Now let's bring our bird in. So as you can imagine, we create a new texture, which I'll call bird. And then we'll set bird to be equal to a new texture, and it's bird.png. Okay, now here's a challenge for you, and it's not easy, but can you get the bird to be drawn in exactly the middle of the screen? So we want the bird to appear in exactly the middle of the screen, the center of the screen. Go for it. I wonder if you managed that. It's harder than you might think. So probably a lot of you started with something like batch.draw and then bird, which is a good start. And then you're thinking, right, what do we want the x coordinate to be? Well, presumably, if we want the bird to be in the center of the screen, we want the x coordinate to be the center of the screen. Now, we know what the screen width is. That's this. So if we divide that by 2, that'll give us the center of the screen. So let's try that out. So gdx.graphics.getWidth divided by 2. And then, similarly, with the height, we want the height divided by 2. And then you may have noticed that if we don't need to specify the width and height, then of the actual asset or texture, we don't need to. So why not just let the size be whatever the size of the sprite is, because I didn't specify that I wanted it a certain size. So that would be a very reasonable solution. So if you attempted that, you would have seen this. And then you might have thought, wait a minute, that doesn't look quite central. And that's because it's not quite central. And that's because what you give when you give this coordinate is you give the coordinate of the bottom left of the sprite. So that's this bit here because it's a square. So it's around there. And that point there is exactly the center of the screen. But of course, what we actually want is the center of the sprite to be in the center of the screen. So what we're going to need to do is move the sprite half its width to the left and then half its width down. And then the center of the sprite will be in the center of the screen, which is what we want. So you may have worked out how to do that. We need to get the width of the sprite or the width of the bird, which we can do using bird.getWidth. So exactly the same as gdx.graphics.getWidth, but obviously on bird this time. And we want to subtract half the width of the bird so that the center of the bird will be in the center of the screen. And exactly the same for the height, but we want to subtract half the height of the bird this time, not half of the width. So well done if you figured that out. This is a little taster. There's going to be a lot of maths in here, I'm afraid. Game development is quite math heavy, and you are going to need to do quite a lot of thinking and working out formulas to get everything to appear in the right place. And there we go. That bird now looks much more central than it did before. Wonderful. So we've got our bird, we've got our background. Our only other aim for this video is to get the bird flapping. So remember, this looks static, but this render method is actually being run again and again. So all we need to do is to, instead of drawing bird each time, we need to draw bird once, and then we need to draw bird 2 the next time, and then bird once, and then bird 2, bird, 2, etc. We need to go back and forth between bird and 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an array of textures, and I'm going to call it birds. And then we're going to have birds this time. Instead of being a new texture, it's going to be a new array of textures, which we create using texture and then square brackets. And we need to specify the number of items in our array, and there's going to be 2. It's going to be bird and bird 2. Then we just specify each of them. So birds 0 is going to be a new texture based on bird.png. So same as what we had before. And then birds 1 is going to be a new texture based on bird2.png. So now instead of displaying just bird every time, we're going to be displaying bird 0, and then birds 1, and then bird 0, etc. Now, of course, to manage that, we're going to have to keep track of which one we want to display at any given time. So I'm just going to split these up a little bit so that all the bird information is kept together. And the way I'm going to deal with that is to have an integer, which I'm going to call flap state. And that's initially going to be 0. So flap state just flips between 0 and 1, and that will keep track of which one we want to display at each time. So now we're just going to do a quick check to say if flap state is equal to 0, then we want to set flap state equal to 1, else flap state equals 0. So flap state will just oscillate, go back and forth between 1 and 0. And then instead of birds, we're going to use instead of bird, we're going to use bird, and then the one that we want is flap state. I'm just going to replace that each time it pops up. There we go. So now we should find that instead of just having a static bird, we get a bird which oscillates between birds 0 and birds 1, which are our 2 textures with the wings up and the wings down. So we should get this animated bird. Now one issue, of course, is that we're not actually controlling the flap speed here, and it's flapping pretty fast. I'm actually going to leave it like that. I'm quite happy with a fast flap. It makes it look a little bit desperate. But if you want to change that and slow that down, you might want to look into animations with GDX. Involve creating something called a texture atlas and texture regions. There's a lot of help out there on the web for that, and if you want to get seriously into game development, I'd recommend going in that direction. But this is a perfectly good rough and ready way of getting an animation going. Alright, so we've got our background and we've got our flapping bird. In the next video, we'll see how to make the bird respond to a tap and float up and down in the way that we saw in the previous video. See you there.